Well, most of us are young children when we first encounter the twin stories in the book of Daniel about the fiery furnace and the lion's den, because, apparently stories about capital punishment are foundational to every child's theological education. And almost universally, we're told that the moral of both stories is that if we trust in God, God will rescue us from danger. But of course, as most of us have figured out by now, that's just objectively untrue. It's probably well past time for us to consider more nuanced interpretations of these ancient stories. In Daniel chapter 3, that fourth figure in the furnace offers us a reminder that God is with us in the midst of our trials and tribulations, as Deanna so beautifully testified in her sermon last week. But for all that these two stories seem to have in common, that analysis doesn't hold up in chapter 6. There was an angelic presence with Daniel in the lion's den, but it's difficult to argue that this figure is meant to be the focus of the story. Here, God's messenger is only mentioned incidentally as a way to explain how Daniel survived, not necessarily as a major plot point. In fact, if we read this story carefully, Daniel almost comes across as a background character. There are only 3 verses out of 27 in which Daniel is the primary actor. And his actions and words in these 3 verses, where he maintains his prayer routine and then explains how he survived the lions, they're really just plot devices to drive the narrative action forward. Could it be that this story isn't actually about Daniel at all, as we've been led to believe for most of our lives? Maybe, given Daniel's one-dimensional portrayal in this chapter, the story's moral resides in the motivations, words, and actions of an entirely different character. So who are we supposed to relate to then, if not the heroic Daniel? Since most of us are just trying to live our lives, not wishing harm upon anyone in particular, and certainly not actively seeking it, I don't think it makes that much sense for us to identify with the scheming officers and chief administrators. But I suspect that we don't see ourselves in King Darius to the degree that maybe we should. Thanks to our Sunday school lessons, we largely picture him as a buffoonish ruler of a distant land, the opposite of us in every way. But we might benefit from focusing on what we have in common with him instead. Set aside the fact that he's a king for a moment. Here is an individual living his life in a society that's not perfect, but at least it seems to be functioning all right in general. It's the kind of place where an outsider is able to work his way up to a position of authority through hard work and unimpeachable character. But some privileged insiders feel threatened by the idea that someone they see as below them could wind up with too much power, too much autonomy. So they become determined to stop that from happening. As a result, Darius finds himself on the receiving end of some very pointed messaging. The privileged insiders propose new laws, laws that make Darius feel important and safe, laws that imply that outsiders are a threat, laws that prohibit them from exercising their own beliefs in their private lives. The insiders, let's call them the lawmakers, they make these laws sound like patriotism. And what could be bad about that? The messaging is overwhelming and persuasive, and so Darius enacts these new laws. But it turns out that he hadn't taken the time to consider the consequences of this law all the way through. The lawmakers purposefully kept their actual intentions quiet. So when Darius is finally able to see the actual impact that the laws have on people he knows and cares about, he's devastated. He tries to save his friend from the prescribed punishment, recognizing that the law was unfair in at least some cases. But the lawmakers insist that the law is absolute and can't be changed. Darius felt that his hands were tied. What could he do? So he allows his friend to be thrown to the lions. Retold in this way, does any of this feel relatable? Can you see the parallels in our own lives? As sensible and sophisticated as we may like to consider ourselves, it's surprisingly easy to manipulate human beings. All of us. It's why marketing and political strategy are such lucrative careers. We all readily allow flattery, misdirection, and falsehoods to guide us towards policies and decisions that sound good in the moment. We don't fully think through the consequences because a lot of money and effort is invested to make sure that we don't, until it's too late. And while Daniel's story ended happily for him, not everyone has an angel sent to protect them. People can actually suffer and die because of our short-sightedness regarding these policies. Good people, people just trying to live their lives, people that we interact with every day, even people that we know and love. Those with a vested interest in these laws for their own selfish reasons try to convince us that they can't be changed once we realize their actual impact. They need us to believe that it's too late, too difficult, or most insidiously, won't make any difference. King Darius did question this assertion. He fussed and he fretted. He tried to find a loophole, but ultimately he allowed Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den, even though every bone in his body was telling him not to. How absurd is that? That the king, remember the one who signed the law, and by the way, had to give the order for it to be carried out, how absurd is it that he would believe that his hands were tied to change it? The fact is that no human law is ever absolute. They don't even exist until human beings, people who are just as fallible as any of us, invent them out of thin air, often based on nothing more than feelings or best guesses. These laws are occasionally made with the best of intentions, but never with the sort of immutability that some might suggest or imply. They can be difficult to change, especially when they're specifically designed to disenfranchise those the most harmed by them, but it's always within someone's power to change them. Now, we may not have the power of royalty, but we famously, proudly live in a representative democracy. Our votes determine who gets to make the law, and sometimes our votes get to determine the law itself. We may find ourselves believing that we're powerless in the face of laws and policies that wind up hurting people, but this is a false helplessness. It's just as absurd for us to believe that our hands are tied as it is for King Darius to believe it. But then even if we're able to get past the deceitful message that nothing can be done, that laws can't be tweaked, we then face another paralyzing thought. How do we know which laws need to be changed? What if we accidentally wind up making things worse? After all, things seem pretty okay for most of us. It must be the law for a reason, we think. So out of a dangerous combination of trepidation and inertia, we defer to the authority of the existing legal system and the people we've entrusted to administer them. King Darius didn't question the law of Media and Persia, which cannot be annulled, because he assumed it to be the highest authority there was. But even in the midst of carrying it out, there was still something telling him that Daniel was innocent. Even though the legal documents he'd signed said otherwise, he could tell that what he was doing was somehow wrong, even though it was legal. This is because there was an even higher law trying to make itself known in his heart. It took him until the end of the chapter to figure it out, but you may already be able to guess what it is. The law of God. Now, I'm not talking about the rules that can be found in the Bible, because many of them were given to a specific people at a specific time. They can be misunderstood depending on what biblical translation you use or how you interpret the meaning. I'm talking about principles that we don't necessarily need to be taught because we're all born with them already in our hearts. Christian ethics calls these principles natural law, which is driven by ideas like justice and mercy, mutual care and love. Because these principles are already in all human hearts, no one has any excuse not to live by them. These laws are eternal and inescapable, and they are what constitutes the ultimate authority on human lives. God's law is the standard that all human laws should rightly be measured against. This is the only law that seeks what's best for all people because it comes from God's wisdom. This is what should have caused King Darius to pause when the new law was first proposed and to repeal it as soon as he realized what he'd done. And this is how we can recognize when a civil law needs to be changed, when God's law in our hearts tells us it's wrong. We may not always get it right the first time, but we just keep trying until one day, when human laws perfectly match God's laws, we find ourselves in the kingdom of heaven, because that's the promise of Scripture. One lesson from Sunday school that did age well is that those who love God should always try to do what God tells us is right, regardless of what human authorities say. And one way that we do that is by changing what isn't. This week, the U.S. election season enters the home stretch as the final major political party holds its national convention. As rallies and debates gain momentum, it's easy for U.S. Americans to assume that the election is about the candidates. But I'd argue that it's about something much more important. In this and in every election, we're declaring what sorts of laws we want to govern us. And it's our chance to see what isn't working and to change it. I will never, ever tell you who to vote for, but I am more than happy to tell you what, as a Christian, I will be voting for. I will not be voting for any particular rules that I want to see enacted because, to be honest, There's no guarantee that any of the promises made on the campaign trail will be kept. We all know what politicians are like. They say what we want to hear. Instead, I'll be voting for justice. I'll be voting for compassion. I'll be voting for kindness. I'll be voting for integrity. I'll be voting for loving my neighbor. And to be clear, I'll be doing this not just in 2.5 months, but in every single election for the rest of my life, no matter who is running. I will be voting for these things because that's how I believe I can best honor God's law. No matter which politicians wind up prevailing in November, I will not consider the work done. I will continue to pay attention to how those in office live out the values that I voted for in their speeches, in their own votes, and in their lives every single day. And if they let me down, I'll remember at the next election. Because admitting that something isn't working isn't failure, it's strength. And none of the people in our government, not a single one, is the king. That title belongs to Christ. I am determined to do whatever I can to help create a world where legality and innocence are not automatically assumed to be the same thing. Where we care more about treating each other with justice than treating each other fairly. Where we recognize that our hands are not tied and we're ultimately beholden to a higher law than any written on Capitol Hill. I hope that you'll join me. And not starting in November. This is not a one-time thing, but starting right now, today. Amen.